Hello, and welcome to Meet the Problem Solvers. I'm Judy Perlman, your host, and I'm very excited today because my guest, Wendell Joseph, is here to talk about some really important matters. Wendell is one of the neighborhood planners for the city of Cambridge, and we're going to talk about sort of what community planning is, where it's come from, where it's going, and in 2019 and looking forward, what else we need to keep thinking about in relation to community planning. So here we go, Wendell. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Judy.
You're welcome. So put us in a little bit of a historical context, if you can.
All right, I'll do my best to summarize historic context. So I think thinking about just problems and challenges and all that, I think a challenge is that cities have grown and changed substantially over time. And I think over the last generation or so, we've seen cities change at a rate that is unlike what we've seen in previous generations. And I say it's a challenge, not necessarily a problem, a challenge in the sense that it puts us in a position to think about how we engage, how we engage with and build cities a little bit differently. We're seeing, people coming into our more urban places, or urban spaces rather, more and more these days. I mean, that's where you have a lot of jobs. That's where you have a lot of opportunities for X, Y, and Z. So the push towards our denser spaces is a trend that we're seeing a lot of. And the challenge then is thinking about, okay, now that we have all these different folks, different kind of folks from different backgrounds, different experiences sharing space, how do we navigate those dynamics and try to facilitate how our cities and our communities continue to grow and develop over time? And I think that's where planning comes in. Planning is kind of like the process of facilitating and managing how human settlements grow and develop over time. And I say human settlements, right, because it can happen in any different kind of scale, any kind of context. It's not just your dense urban metropolis like a Boston or Chicago or New York, right? But it also can happen, in our more rural areas that are still, very much still agricultural in nature and everything in between, right? So anywhere people live requires some kind of thought, some kind of process, some kind of practice on how that might change 10, 20, 30 years from now. So planning, when it really became a thing in the early 20th century, was a very top-down, heavy-handed approach to the built environment. I mean, we had folks coming through just doing whatever, whenever, however, with no consideration or no thought, no dialogue with people who were on the ground who were being impacted by those decisions. We have the Robert Moseses of New York, right? I mean, that's one of the guys that's we think of a lot in planning as kind of like symbolic of that era or that type of planning, where it's like the power broker, so to speak, to borrow the title of the book. That just, you got the guy making all the decisions and that's it gets done.
As we talked about, a guy with a map and a red pencil.
Right.
Boom.
Right, and that's it gets done, and entire communities are lost, entire ways of life are just destroyed, and that was kind of like the approach, right? And in response to that, there was periods of insurgence, of people rising up, of organizing amongst themselves and pushing back against the powers that be, pushing back against the state, and that mentality of heavy-handed top-down approach. We know what we're doing. We know what's best for you, or we don't care either way. It's just going to happen. And so you had all these movements that kind of like push back against that. And Boston had its own once upon a time in the late 40s, early 50s, when the inner belt was being talked about. Activists and community organizers across the region kind of like mobilized themselves and pushed back, and it didn't end up becoming a thing. I mean, there's still parts of it that were implemented, but the complete ring was never completed because of that local activism and organizing against that kind of thing.
I could just say, I went to school in Rochester, New York, and they did build the inner ring. They called it the inner belt, I think. Right. And it totally decimated.
Yeah.
I mean, what was inside kind of just crumbled, and what was right near it got really run down and mostly disinvested. Yeah. Right. Really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. And, I think that's the kind of, movement I think that then put a kind of like a pin in planning as an industry and kind of like shifted things a little bit. Both planning and politics, I think, because I mean the two are very much go hand in hand. And so in recent years and recent decades, you've seen more of a push towards public participation, where any kind of planning process you engage in has to include some measure of engagement with the public, so that they're part of that process. Mm-hmm. They're part of the the conceptualizing, the brainstorming, and the dialogue, and ultimately, hopefully, the decision making, right? So that it's not just government or consultants or experts making all the decisions, but it is something that's meant to be a little bit more holistic, a little bit more integrated. And I think that's kind of like where we are now, generally speaking. But I also think we're at a point where a lot of folks in planning are really thinking about, okay, well, what's the next step? Because I think so this is where the problem comes in, right? So the challenge is in that cities are growing and they're changing rapidly at a rate that we quite frankly are not set up to respond to. So that's the challenge. The problem is that we're not set up to it, and the systems and the processes that we have in place that we've used that have been at our disposal for so long are not set up to respond to that rate of change, but then respond to what that means in terms of the people who are looking to be part of processes and people who need to be part of processes. And so
let me just break in for a second.
Please,
so, for example, I know I've lived in Cambridge for 30 years. I can't believe that number, but it's a true fact.
Yeah.
I've been to the city council.
Yeah.
There is a mechanism, and I think it's a long-standing mechanism of public comment.
Right.
You write your comment, you read it, and then you submit it. Mm-hmm. And that was, for many years, sort of that qualified as public input.
Correct. Right. So you have that form of public input. I think thinking about other kinds of development, for example, processes, you will have, this thing where you have to have a community meeting as a developer, right? If you're coming in, you have a project, whether you're a developer, the owner, whomever, you have to set up a community meeting ahead of time, usually with abutters, to present your proposal, to say what you're trying to do. You talk about the impacts of the community, and then there's that exchange as well. Very, very formal and, procedural and all that kind of stuff. And you're right. I mean, I think those are, generally speaking, the ways in which people are part of decision-making processes that have an impact on their communities. But again, I think the critique there is, well, how much of that actually makes a difference, right? If, how much does it make a difference to create that space in that specific kind of way for people to be able to say things? And, I'm sure it has some kind of, it makes a difference. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. But how impactful is it? And is there something else? Is there another way? Are there other ways that we can look to that might have a greater amount of impact on how we engage in these conversations around development, around planning, that is a little bit more democratic, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more equitable?
And maybe also tries to reach beyond, hey, if you want to have a voice here, come to City Hall in the evening to deliver your message in this particular way. How do we get ourselves out of that locked-in box?
Correct. I think that's definitely the question for me. It's something that I've thought about a great deal. I've spoken about it a number of times with folks, both within my own organization and outside of it. Just think like, what else is there? What are the different methods? What are the different strategies? What are the different kind of spaces that we can create, that we can open up to have different forms of engagement, different forms of input that can also contribute to like the overall dialogue or civic dialogue. I think
so wait, let me just, very interested to dive in to some of those mechanisms, some of those forms. Let me just say, this is Meet the Problem Solvers. I'm Judy Perlman. My guest tonight is Wendell Joseph, a neighborhood planner for the city of Cambridge, who is going to really help us unpack best practices moving forward into the world of truly responsive community input.
Sure, yeah. So to build off of what we were saying, like, what are the different ways that we can accommodate different voices and the different ways that those voices are expressed? I think for me that is the key. I think the public comment period at a city council meeting, or the public comment period during like a planning board meeting or community meeting, does have value and it has merit. Personally, I think it does cater to a specific kind of an individual, specific kind of personality even. I mean, we've heard a lot of times, those of us in the community development field talk about, people who don't participate in those specific kind of ways being, burdened by whatever kind of life circumstances they are. Maybe they work multiple jobs. Maybe they, have children. They have to be home in the evening, or maybe this, or maybe that. And so I think the conversation tends to skew around life circumstances, which is certainly a part of it. But there are other reasons I think why people do not engage in certain kind of ways. On the one hand, it could be a personality thing. I think society definitely caters towards the extroverts, right? And I think those examples of a council meeting, a public comment council meeting, or a planning board meeting definitely, I think, cater to that, where people who are more than comfortable speaking up and speaking out in a public setting, right? So I think it matters on personality. It does matter in terms of like your comfortability in a particular language. So for those whose first language may not be English, it does create a bit of a challenge, right, where you might not feel comfortable, or you may not feel comfortable expressing yourself in a dominant language. I think it also speaks to another reason why people may not feel comfortable engaging in those ways is just a long history of disenfranchisement, or just like disillusionment, or to the whole process. It's like, my voice has never mattered. The voices of people like me, or people who think like me, have never mattered. Why should it matter now? I'm over it. Let me just focus on me and mine, and just you guys, because. And so I think that is also something to account for, is the degree to which the process itself has ostracized certain people. And so I think there is a need for us to have space where multiple people can express themselves in the ways that they feel most comfortable, and have that also be important and valued and part of the overall dialogue that we have as a society and as a community.
So tell us, how have you done that? How has the city done that? How are you doing that as a person in the world?
That's a good question. I think I can speak to both. So I think one great example, and I very much enjoy talking about this in terms of how we've done that, as a city, as a department, is through the Envision Cambridge process.
Wait, Envision Cambridge?
Envision Cambridge.
Okay.
So Envision Cambridge was a 3-year planning and community engagement process that the city recently wrapped up, and it was about creating a blueprint for the city's growth and development for the next, 10 to 20 years. It's a comprehensive plan. Master plan is very, very common in urban planning, where you kind of like have some sort of a blueprint or a map for how the city might develop, right? It's not an exact science, right? It's a moving target, but you want to
lock it in,
right? You don't lock it in.
Some big framing,
Precisely. And I would also say, before I go on, that there's no such thing as a perfect process. I think whether it's a planning process, whether it's an engagement process, whatever the process is, there's no such thing as a perfect process. And I think that it's important to say that out front. And I think and I don't think there's any shame in saying that. I think you try to do the best that you can with the information that you have. You go about it as best you can with the best intentions. You do your outreach, you do your engagement, you try as much as you can to get everybody together to talk through some things. But there's always going to be blind spots, unfortunately. There's always going to be things that you miss. I think the important thing is to learn from that. And then, again, plan for how you might do things differently next time. With that said, I think one of the great things that we did through Envision Cambridge was we really thought long and hard about how we might engage and include the voices of people who typically are not part of these kind of processes. Specifically, linguistic and ethnic minorities. So that meant the American-born Black population, and other communities and other groups where English may not necessarily be their first language. So what we did was,
and City Hall may not be their preferred locale.
Precisely.
Right.
City Hall may not be their preferred locale to be able to share their thoughts on their communities.
And their aspirations for the community.
Precisely, yeah. So what we did was we partnered with the Community Engagement Team. The Community Engagement Team, or CET, is an initiative or a program that is run out of the Department of Human Service Programs, the city's Department of Human Service Programs. And it's basically a team of outreach workers. They are outreach workers that are part of different communities and groups. And their job is basically to connect families in their specific communities with the wide amount of resources that are available here in Cambridge. So we've got folks working with the Chinese community, folks working with the Haitian community, the Bengali community, Spanish-speaking community, Arabic community, Amharic, so the Ethiopian community. It's a pretty impressive and group, and they do a lot of amazing work. And city departments are always looking to work with them to do this kind of stuff. So for Envision Cambridge, we partnered with the community engagement team to basically just do focus groups with families and individuals from those respective communities, and it was a pretty amazing process. We did have to go about things a little bit differently because to be able to accommodate the folks that we were trying to talk to in ways that would make them feel comfortable. So when we were going to those focus group meetings, there was only two of us from the city. Right, we didn't have any more than that, which is a little bit different from some of our more traditional or mainstream forms of public participation, where it's like you have a squad of like city staff and consultants show up to help facilitate the process, talk to people, da 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 da. Right, but with this smaller, more intimate setting, we were told no more than two. And so the outreach workers were there also as well. The families that they invited, the individuals that they invited were also part of the conversation. And we would have a dialogue around the same topics that we would have in some of our larger public meetings. The meetings were all done in English. So every now and then, though, the outreach workers might try to, relay certain concepts or things or some of the things we were talking about to those individuals in their native tongue, which was, always pretty cool. It was a great process. I mean, I think...
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Where were some of these, like where and what time of day, what part of the week?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the locations varied. We were keen to hold meetings in certain locations, right? I mean, stepping back to just talk about planning on a more larger scale. I mean, we talk about going to where people are.
Yeah, going to where people are.
Absolutely,
right,
exactly. And that's absolutely what we did. So, I mean, we had a few of those focus group meetings at Margaret Fuller Neighborhood House. We had a handful over at Ridge Towers. We had some at the library that's right down the street from Ridge Towers. I forgot the name of the library branch out there.
Maybe or something.
I think it's yeah. So the locations definitely varied, and it was pretty cool. I think we had a good time. There were some things that we heard from those meetings that were similar to some of the stuff that we heard in some of our larger public meetings. Some things were a little bit different, and I think I think it was great, and it was nice that we had that kind of intention in getting those kinds of input and those individuals part of that conversation.
So you went to alternate locales.
Yeah.
I imagine you didn't just do it during 9 to 5. You did
No, not just during 9 to 5. I think more often than not they would be after hours. So more often than not they were evening meetings. I think sometimes we may have done things over the weekend. But more often than not, they were typically in the evening. But like I said, it was a great process, and it's caused us, in the community development department, to kind of go back and think through how we might want to continue that same kind of engagement moving forward. And so internally we've talked about trying to create our own community engagement team, whose role would just be to help the community development department to work with and talk to and engage with families in those different communities, specifically around planning topics and community development and so on and so forth.
Super cool.
Yeah.
So let me ask, is there any story, any example that you can sort of tie back to a voice that you heard at one of those meetings, what you or somebody else from your team that actually rolled into a new set of, a different recommendation? Right.
So I think one of the things that stood out to me the most that I've still held on to was, we were talking about. So it was one of our conversations. We were talking about all these different things that folks would like to see and see more of. In Cambridge, and across the board, people generally just want to have a high quality of life and they want what's best for their kids.
Yeah.
Right? Regardless of who you talk to, people just kind of want to just have a good life and have access to a whole bunch of different cool amenities and just really enjoy their lives and provide a good solid rounded life for their children. So we were having one of those kind of discussions. The topic was around, young people in Cambridge and how at some point in time it seems like there's a gap in resources. City does a great job of providing a whole bunch of different programs and all these different things for young children during the summer. But then it seemed, based on what folks were telling us, that once kids hit 18, it's there's a gap. It's so what does my 18, 19, 20-year-old do during the summer when they're maybe home from school? Or what have you. And so, we heard a lot about the need for more water play activities. Water play activities. Okay. Tot lots and, splash ponds or frog ponds, but also indoor swimming areas, right? And we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We could use some more of that. But then there was this one particular woman who also mentioned it would also be great if we were to have, this was a Muslim woman, and she said that it would be great if we were to have designated swim hours so that Muslim women can also take advantage of this amenity and be able to swim, right? Which is something that I would not have thought
Yeah.
of, right? And she mentioned that there are spaces in Boston that have that kind of programming set up where there are designated hours where Muslim women can come and enjoy the pool and swim and have a good time, all that kind of stuff.
And it's just, they're really the only people who are there because there are no men,
Correct.
no boys. Yeah.
Correct. And I mean, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is profound because had she not been there to say that, that would have been one of our blind spots.
Right.
And not because we don't have the best of intentions, not because we don't care either way, but it's a blind spot. I think creating the space for people of various backgrounds to come in and share is a way of checking your blind spots, but also leveraging your privilege to create that kind of stuff. I'm not a Muslim man, so I wouldn't necessarily think to that end of like, hey, we could use some designated hours so a Muslim woman can swim. But being able to provide a space where she could come in and voice that was
Right.
important. And I think ultimately that's the end goal is that you want perspective to inform some of these processes, to inform what the outcomes might potentially be. So that was just something that I think I think about quite often, and that's always my first go-to example of how that effort, how that method of engagement had an impact on us.
Yeah, and I love the idea that you guys are thinking of building this in as an ongoing sort of existing piece.
Correct.
As we were talking about at the 1369 Coffee House.
Yes, check it out.
there is this whole thing of sort of privilege and the blind spots that we all bring.
Correct.
And I think it's pretty cool that my own city is, actually thinking of investing money in creating a standing framework to say, it's not enough for us to occasionally do a focus group here or there, but this is a real commitment.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think to the degree that we want to create additional spaces for civic dialogue and engagement, I think it does require a measure of intention and a measure of will, but also you need resources to be able to pull that off, right? I mean, yes, you absolutely need money available to be able to fund these different kind of forums. You need time, right? You need capacity. You need people who are available and willing to be able to facilitate those conversations as well. And so it's not enough to just say, hey, we need more of this. I think we have to be very clear that it does require more also. Right. We can't just expect to do more with the same, right? We need to do more with more. And so I think that's also something to think about.
Cool.
Yeah.
So this is Meet the Problem Solvers. I'm Judy Perlman. Thanks so much for joining us. Wendell Joseph is here today. I'm sorry, I'm in a very creaky chair. I'm sure everyone is hearing this creakiness.
Yeah.
Wendell works at the City of Cambridge in the Community Development Department as a neighborhood planner and has really been talking about his own growing awareness as a person, but also organizationally, this embrace of diversity. And so, we often try to sort of wrap the show up with some thoughts about, so where do we go from here? What are the next steps that the city's going to take? And quite frankly, what can we be doing as active participants?
That's a good question. I mean, I liked how you framed the personal piece to it as well, because that's something I did want to speak to, some questions you asked earlier. But I think a lot of what I'm talking about, to what I've mentioned in our time here tonight, I think it does start at the individual level. I think each person has to kind of go on their own journey and try to understand and wrestle with what it means to be part of a diverse and equitable and just society, but not only be part of it, but the part that you play, the role that you can play in that equitable and just and healthy society. And a lot of that is dependent on your own privilege, right? Again, I mean, the more you have, the more you've kind of got to give, and more that you need to be part of what is it we're trying to do. And so I think for me, thinking about my own privilege, like as a male, for example, and how that informs, how I interact with other people who, either are not male or has been something that I've learned. And it's been something like the things that I've kind of taken away from that personal growth has informed how I interact with people, generally speaking. And I think it really is about being able to create space for people to not only be themselves, but also bring themselves into a particular space. And you not imposing, your worldview on that
Right.
individual, but leaving yourself open to be challenged and also to be changed as a result. And so I think a lot of it does very much start at the individual level, and then it then transitions to interpersonal, how we interact with each other as human beings, right? And the space that we are able to create for each other to be ourselves and to bring ourselves, it then obviously does filter up to the institutional level. So thinking about our processes and how do we structure our political and our planning processes to accommodate people, the wide range of people, and how do we, at an institutional level, create the space for people to be themselves and bring themselves, and ultimately it does inform our ideology, which impacts everything else, right? The ideology of creating space. I keep saying this, for people to be themselves and to bring themselves, and I think it does mean choosing,
like
right?
identifying that as a priority as
Yeah.
opposed to some other community that doesn't prioritize that.
Right. I mean, it has to be a priority, and obviously, there has to be some follow through. Otherwise, it's just nice words. And I think a lot of it, the reason why I bring it back to individuals, because it is about, first and foremost, valuing people.
Yeah.
Period. Valuing people, valuing their voice as a result, but also valuing the different ways in which that voice is expressed. And so, jumping back to what we mentioned in the beginning, it's not just about public comment at City Hall or public comment at Planning Board or whatever, but what are the other ways that people express themselves in ways that are most comfortable to them?
This is so crazy. Here's what I'm going to do, Wendell. As this show is taking on its new life, we are really interested in hearing from you and extending our own level of discourse and exchange of ideas.